mental map issue. If our mental map is flawed, no matter how hard we try, we're not going to get there. And my thesis is that right now, you and I are living in an era, this exciting, thrilling era of awakening, but we are still trapped inside a map that is taking us down, that doesn't allow us to see possibility. So my job in the time I have is to simply give you a tour of that mental map. My job is to say, okay, we're trapped in these thoughts that we've got to spring free, so we've got to make some thought leaps. So the dominant mental map is a mental map that many philosophers have called the mechanical worldview. It's one where we see ourselves separate from one another and separate from nature. We see reality as fundamentally about quantities that are fixed and scarce. I call it the premise of lack of goods, not enough energy, food, or parking places in Boston, in my case, or not enough goodness. There's not enough good qualities in human beings. We are fundamentally selfish little shoppers. When you peel away the layers and get down to what you can really count on, we learn that we absorb the idea that we are simply competitive and materialistic and accumulators, right? So that is the worldview. It is a world that is pretty scary, that I believe that is taking us down. At the same time, let me just say, add here, that it is a very consequential set of assumptions. Because if we see the world through this mental map of lack of goods and goodness, in this quantitative idea of fixed entities, then in this competitive struggle, this frightening one, with this very dim view of ourselves, we're apt to feel that we have to turn over our fate to others, and preferably turn over our fate to some impersonal law that will sort out the outcomes for us. And we were so happy in 1980s when Ronald Reagan even came up with a name for it. It was called the magic of the market. We turn over our fate to this magical force and let it solve the problem, let it sort out the outcomes, and it will all work out for benign outcomes for everyone. The problem is we came up with this peculiar idea of a market that is one driven by one rule: highest return to existing wealth. So what happens, that means highest return to people who run the companies and own shares in them. So what has happened over these 30 years is a massive wealth returning to wealth, so that by 2005, Citigroup, not Francis Moore-Lappe, but Citigroup named our economy a plutonomy, because 1% of households control as much wealth as the bottom 95%. And it's quickening, so that from the year 2002 to 2007, before the big financial crash, 2/3 of the income gains were going to the top, very few percent at the top. So what happens when we start with the premise of lack, turn over our fate, we end up with this concentration of wealth that then infects our political decision making. And this is very critical. I'm going to come back at the end of it, very fundamental to how we address every single problem in our world today, whether it is climate change or poverty and hunger in the world. So let me just say then that how we think about ourselves is absolutely foundational to whether we're going to make this turn toward life. So I want to just start with what are the thought traps that keep us locked into creating this world that we do not want, because it turns out that if we give over our fate to this automatic market that returns wealth to wealth, we end up creating exactly the conditions that bring out the worst in us, that are malaligned with our own nature and with nature itself. So what is the first thought trap? The first one that I think begins the downward slide that we have to break free of is exactly about this, our nature itself. The idea that fundamentally all we can count on is that we are material, selfish, competitive. And in fact, There is now a revolution in understanding of human nature among scientists across everything from neuroscience to psychology to anthropology. We are discovering something else, that we are much, much more complex than that. That in fact, that there are at least 5 or 6 qualities that are soft-wired into us. I say soft-wired because they show up if we set the conditions to bring them out, like any organism in nature. And I'll just tick them off briefly here because there's so much more to be said about them, but I think they might ring true to you without a lot of evidence. They are, number 1, that we are soft-wired to be cooperators. They've done MRI scans when we're competing and when we're cooperating. They discover that when human beings cooperate, that parts of our brains, the pleasure centers they're stimulated. We love it so much that it's as good as eating chocolate. So we are cooperators. We are also naturally empathetic. We have that potential. In fact, we are so empathetic in part because we are wired with mirror neurons, so that when I'm doing this with my hands, that you too are as if you are doing the same. We are cooperators. We are empathetic with one another. We sense each other moment to moment. We also, I would say, there's a lot of evidence that we are soft-wired for fairness, for basic fairness, that we evolved in tightly knit tribes, and we knew that our own survival depended upon the welfare of the tribe and the cohesion of the tribe, and what kills any kind of group is unfairness. And so Adam Smith, actually, who many people think of as the godfather of greed, no. He was a profound social philosopher who said, quote, "We are in some peculiar manner tied, bound, and obliged to the observation of justice." So cooperation and empathy and fairness, we are also have deep, what I call soft wiring for efficacy, for power, that human beings couldn't have gotten to this beautiful, complex society that we are in unless we were fundamentally doers, not whiners and couch potatoes. And we are also creatures of meaning. I think that doesn't need explanation at this point. So what I'm suggesting is that we have what it takes to make this turn toward life, to shift this mental map. So if we're so great, then what's off? What I'm suggesting is that we are complex, and what we now have to grow up as a species to recognize that depending on the circumstance, we will either show up in these fantastically pro-social qualities as problem solvers to turn our planet in a positive direction, or we also know, as throughout history, from the Holocaust to the Abu Ghraib prison setting, that under the wrong conditions, that we will brutalize one another. And whether it be in lab experiments or in historical moments, we know that not a few of us, but most of us will behave brutally under the wrong conditions. And so today I'm going to posit that I think we have a somewhat of an idea about what are the conditions that bring out the worst in us. They are the concentration of power. It includes transparency, lack of transparency, that is, secrecy, and also cultures of blame where we're out there pointing fingers at one another. So again, whether it's a lab experiment like the famous Stanford experiment in 1971 where they put young people in a lab and some were given the role of guards and some were given the role of prisoners, and they were supposed to last for 6 weeks in this lab experiment on how behavior changes in that kind of prison setting. They had to stop it after 6 days because the young people were so brutalizing each other, the guards over the prisoners, that they had to stop it. So we know. So my suggestion is that to break out of this thought trap that we are just these selfish little shoppers and that then make us believe that we can't really do democracy, we can't come together as problem solvers, what we really need to understand about ourselves is the thought leap is to accept the complexity of who we are, the good, the bad, and the very ugly, and then think with an EcoMind, what are the conditions? Like any organism, any plant you planted in your backyard, any organism, It flourishes depending upon what are the conditions around it. And we can begin then to identify what are the conditions that bring out the best in us and keep the worst in us in check. And I'm suggesting that we know now that the concentration of power brings out the worst, so that we can begin together by our own development of our own power to begin to work in the dispersion of power, to keep things transparent and open through face-to-face community, and to stop the blame game. And because in an thinking like an ecosystem, we see that there are no parts, there are only participants, as Hans-Peter Dürer, the German physicist, put it. So we are all implicated. If everything is connected in an ecological system, then there are no people to blame, oh, it's your fault. We are all connected, and therefore we are all part of the problem, and therefore all part of the solution. So that is the beginning then of the thought shift. The thought leap is into the sense of the complexity of our nature and creating the conditions that bring out the best. Within the environmental movement itself are thought traps that I think we need to challenge. And there are a cluster of them. That I'm just going to put under the general heading of there's the idea that we've hit the limits of a finite earth. One hears that quite frequently. One hears, oh, it is growth. We've got to stop growth because that is killing our planet. And we also hear that it's consumer society that is to blame. And so each of these has different elements. But I'm going to suggest that all three of them need to be challenged and broken free of. First of all, to say that growth is the problem is problematic for me. To say that growth is our problem, why is that a thought trap? I'm suggesting saying that growth is a problem is a thought trap because it blesses what we're currently doing with the word growth that most people think of as pretty positive. I want my tomatoes to grow, my granddaughters to grow, my friendships to grow. Growth to most people is positive. And if we say what we've been doing is growth, that's really confusing. Just think about this. Think about this. What we're really producing is waste and destruction. Let's not call it growth. What I mean is that the Moore-Lappe estimates that something like 55% of all energy in the United States is wasted. Another estimate puts it as high as 87% is wasted. Now, that begins to be a little bit more believable if you realize that the fuel coming into a typical power plant in the United States, 2/3 of it is wasted in waste heat. So energy, tremendous waste, not to mention the destruction. For example, coal, a study led by Harvard University just concluded that coal in this society, the cost of coal that we're all paying for, that isn't incorporated into the price of coal, is about 1/3 of $1 trillion a year. Let's not call that growth. So first of all, that's energy. But what about food? Food. About 40 to 50% of the food that is ready for harvest in the fields in the US is wasted. Water. Water. Do you know that to create 1 pound of beef in the industrial intensive chemical system in the United States takes about as much as, I've seen estimates from 3 to as much as 12,000 gallons of water. So I'm suggesting that let's break free of the notion that growth is the problem because we have been destroying and wasting. And similarly, phrasing the challenge as we've hit the limits of a finite earth, again, that is misleading because in fact, as I've already argued, there's more than enough food in the world for us. And if you just look at energy, for example, the potential